Insider session.
Well, of course, I want to welcome everybody. I'm glad to see you all here for a topic that most salespeople love to hate, that has to do with cold calling. There are often a few of us that actually love it because of its challenges, and in the end, the success and the results that it brings. But there's a broad spectrum of opinion. Lots of folks are wondering, is it worth it? What can I do to make it better? And we're all going to dive into some of those ideas today. So I'm glad that you chose to join us and hope that you will continue being with us the second Tuesday of every month as we continue our virtual insiders.
Great, thanks, Deb. I'm going to start the presentation now, so hopefully everybody can see that. And I've taken the liberty of putting everybody on mute just while I walk through today's presentation. That'll keep things moving. But at the end of the presentation, which will only last about 20 or 25 minutes, we'll split into breakout rooms as usual. And each room will have a couple of our own wise guys, and you'll get a chance to take yourselves off mute and introduce yourself, ask questions, and share your own thoughts on today's topic with the other attendees and our fellow wise guys. And during the presentation, you can also always ask questions in the chat window. And if we don't get to it during the presentation, we'll be sure to touch on it in the breakout rooms. And with that, let's get started. So today, as Deb mentioned, we're going to revisit a favorite topic. And every time we come back to it, we like to sort of re-examine whatever the current status of cold calling is in the current B2B environment. Obviously, a lot has changed over the past 12 to 16 months, and in the 12 months since we talked about this topic most recently. And we'll take a closer look at some of the strategies sales reps can use to engage prospects and set first-time appointments over the phone. And as we'd like to do periodically, we'll offer a fresh look on a few of our go-to cold call scripts to see what still works, what might need a refresh, and why. So last year around this time, we talked a little bit about some of the new pressures and incentives that were facing cold callers. This was exactly a year ago, so we were just about 6 weeks into the pandemic, and there was a lot that was uncertain. So even though we all likely feel like we're on steadier business footing than we were last year at this time, the status of cold calling still feels uncertain to many. And here are a few examples of some questions that I know that we and our clients have been thinking about and asking ourselves. How have changes to businesses' bottom line affected what your prospects want or need? There are obviously new budgetary constraints for many companies, but many are also re-entering the post-COVID landscape with teams that look different than they did before and who are in turn being asked to do different things. So that can affect the strategies that businesses choose to adopt and pay for. Similarly, in the age of video conferences, where we're all on screens almost all the time for our interactions with other people, where does phone-based cold calling fit in? We all interact so much through a computer screen that a non-Zoom phone call from somebody that you don't know might seem especially out of place. Plus, going mostly virtual has had some major efficiency advantages that are likely to remain indefinitely. So what does that mean for traditional cold calling? Is what I or my prospects offer still relevant in today's environment? And based on the answer to that first question about changes to the bottom line, there are almost no businesses that haven't made at least some small adjustments to their value proposition, the unique value that they provide to their prospects and customers over the past year. And zeroing in on that new unique value in a cold call can seem challenging. And then finally, what are the goals and next steps of your cold call when in-person appointments are largely still off the table? It used to be that you'd use a phone call to set up a face-to-face meeting, but what do you do now when you can assume that a significant percentage of your prospects may still be uncomfortable with that? And actually, a study published in October by McKinsey found that only 20 to 30% of B2B buyers want to ever interact with sales reps in person, even in their ideal post-COVID-19 models. This is likely to be a question for some time. But despite all that uncertainty, it's not all or even mostly bad news. If you look at them in a different way, these same pressures can actually be seen as a shift in favor of cold calling. On the left, budgetary impacts are not equal. Some firms and sectors are thriving, and the companies that identify who those are and focus their cold prospecting, cold outreach efforts on them have opportunities to capitalize on. B2B seller interactions are now mostly remote or digital, which in some ways makes it easier to reach new customers. When you think of cold calling as sort of the ultimate old school way of remote prospecting, it sort of fits in with what we're doing now. Everybody is at their desks almost all the time, which means that there are multiple ways to reach prospects, including over the phone. And it's sort of a natural way for people to interact with other B2B professionals. On the value proposition question, businesses that adjust their offer effectively have some real opportunities to capitalize on. And finally, in a remote world, you can be more flexible in accommodating your prospect for that next step. You don't have to worry about driving to an appointment. You can always offer a video conference and be more flexible about the timing and trust that their schedule will be more accommodating as well. So the question becomes, if we need to change the way we think about approaching cold calling from a strategic perspective, do we also need to change what we say to a prospect when we get them on the phone? And that's where our scripts come in. It's always been our firm belief that you don't need a rigid cold call script that you use for every call to navigate it from the beginning to the end. And that's largely because cold calling shouldn't be about the words that you're saying. It should be about getting your prospect to talk so you can listen and respond. And that requires a little bit more flexibility. So in contrast, we like to think of each cold call as some combination of these phases, and to think about how to navigate them in terms of short, flexible scripts you can use to maximize the chances of a positive outcome for both you and your prospect. And before I get into the first script, I'll just invite Deborah to offer any thoughts she might have. Deb, I think you're on mute.
I did it. Sorry, folks. Sometimes people don't like the word scripts because they're afraid that that's too exacting. And as Sam was saying, we're not talking about very narrow opportunity to say very specific things, but more of an outline of the way you want to be thinking about your responses or how to begin the call and those kinds of things. So flexibility is certainly the key here.
And I know one thing, Deb, you mentioned when we were preparing for this presentation is that, those new pressures that I listed a couple of slides ago, that they're real and they present challenges, but it's always been the case that people make excuses not to cold call. And these are just sort of the newest excuses. And the biggest obstacle to overcome is your own head trash about cold calling. And I think the idea here is to think about these pressures as reasons to engage in cold calling, because the ones who do it are the ones who are going to be successful. So that brings us to our first script, which we call the voicemail email combo. And the fact that we're starting here is probably a good indicator of how cold calling has changed in recent months and years. And that's because you can no longer think about cold calling without also thinking about how to reach your prospects when they don't answer the phone. And that's one of the advantages and challenges of a landscape where the buyer-seller interaction is mostly remote. There are more than one way to reach your prospects, and you can use those various methods to complement each other. And cold calling is going to be most effective if you maximize those other channels. And since it's long been a fact that the vast majority of calls, upwards of 80% or more, go to voicemail, it's critical to have a voicemail strategy that includes a well-rehearsed message and plan for follow-up. Here's just one example of a short and sweet voicemail you can leave. And the important things to keep in mind here are that, to sort of contradict what I just said, you should have a rigid script when it comes to voicemail, because voicemail is the one area where there's no excuse not to nail it every time, since you're just reciting words into the phone. And just a note that if you do have a voicemail script that you like to use and you're comfortable sharing it, please do so in the breakout room at the end of the presentation. It's always interesting and enlightening to hear what strategies everybody's using. But secondly, with respect to this message, using your voicemail to set up your next move, in this case, a follow-up email to your prospect with additional information. And as you can see here, something that might appear odd about this message, it doesn't include a phone number for a callback. And that's because the odds that your prospect will call you back are very slim anyway. So we've chosen in our strategy to focus our energy on setting up that next step. And when it comes to that follow-up email, here's what we found to be most important and effective. Obviously, referring to the voicemail you just left, talking about your solution to your prospect's problem. So for business-wise, it might be something like how to fill your prospecting pipeline with local sales opportunities. And then you may also want to include a brief description of what your company offers, particularly as it relates to the current economic climate. So we have here business-wise helps our clients increase connections with local B2B decision makers and boosts first-time appointments. Other information that might be helpful to your prospect. Here we'll include firmographic information about companies in a prospect's local market, and then maybe even a link to a landing page where you can gather more information about your prospect. And as far as why the strategy works, the first point to make is that a voice message that is clear, concise, and direct is more likely to resonate with your prospect. They're more likely to listen, understand, and remember, and therefore to respond. Secondly, whenever you offer something of value, it gives your prospect a reason to engage, even if they never expect to buy from you, which is all you're asking them to do at this point anyway. And then finally, following up on your voicemail with an email uses those multiple channels I mentioned to amplify your message, which only increases the odds that they'll respond. Deborah, did you have anything on voicemail?
And not at this point, other than the fact that when you're using a list that doesn't have email with it, your chances of connections are much, much lower.
Right, good point. Having both the phone and email data for your prospect helps you execute a strategy like this that might be a little bit more sophisticated and generate better results. So now let's get into the scripts you can use when you actually get a prospect on the phone. And our intro script is something we like to call the double handshake. So this, again, is the first script we recommend using when your prospect answers your call. So this is sort of the hello phase of the phone call. And we call it a double handshake because it's sort of a two-pronged introduction. The first prong is to establish that you haven't met your prospect and to ask permission to continue speaking. So if you get a yes, that's all you need. You can dive right into the phone call without moving on to the second part. But if your prospect says no, which they often will, you move on to that second prong, which is to ask if there's a better time today for you to connect. And the reason this works is that asking for permission when your prospect helps your prospect open the door to the conversation, and it's more likely to be congenial. But it also, part of the reason we say we've never met and we don't mention our company is because it reduces friction. And friction is sort of the general idea in sales and marketing that any distraction that gives you your prospect a reason to say no or think about something else just reduces the likelihood that they'll say yes. So a lot of our cold call scripts are based on the idea that friction should be minimal. And that's something that I'd invite you to think about and potentially talk about later in the breakout rooms. So again, yes, the reason to establish that you haven't met is to remove the potential friction. You want your prospect to focus and respond to what you're saying and not be distracted trying to remember whether they know you or your company. And then finally, the second prong of the double handshake where you ask, is there another time today, applies gentle pressure on your prospect and conveys a sense of urgency. Makes it a little harder for him or her to brush you off. And often your prospect will just agree to talk now rather than try to find time later in that day. And this script is just sort of an illustration of a quick tactic you can use at the beginning of the call based on some proven techniques with the idea of engaging a prospect quickly and early. Deborah, do you have anything to add here?
You're good, Sam.
Yeah. So for our third script, we use the acronym TRICK, which stands for the reason I'm calling. And this is sort of the what's this about phase of the call. So at this point, your prospect is starting to wonder what you're calling about and what you want from him or her. And the idea behind TRICK, again, is twofold. The first is it's sort of a mnemonic device that helps you remember to be direct and get to the point. And secondly, to ensure that your call has a purpose that both you and your prospect are clear on. So you can see here a couple of examples. The reason I'm calling is to learn more about, is to set a time to meet, is to show you some ideas about. And the idea is to get directly to the point about what you're requesting of your prospect. Obviously, this is designed to avoid wasting time and getting directly to the point. It's a direct approach based on professionalism and being respectful. But it's also designed to elicit that follow-up question from your prospects. Who are you and what do you do? So crafting that clear what we do statement to respond to their question is critical. One idea before you come up with your own cold call scripts would be to brainstorm with your colleagues about the reason for your call. What is your goal? Are you trying to set an appointment? Are you trying to discover if there's a reason to connect in the first place? Are you trying to offer something of value, no strings attached? At this stage, you obviously have to assume that your prospect isn't close to thinking about buying. So you ask yourself, as we've hammered home time and time again, what do they get from a meeting with you, even if they don't buy something? Why should they give you their valuable time? And again, your goal should be to have that answer to the clarifying question of who are you and what's this about? And here's an example of some what we do statements that we might use at business-wise. You can see here that we've used pain words whenever possible: concerns, confusion, frustration, and we focus on the prospect's problems and challenges. And remember, old value propositions may be irrelevant or outdated, so take the opportunity to think hard about ways you can make the reason I'm calling into something that helps your prospect in today's economic landscape. And of course, for us, the other key after each of these pain points is that the prospect must also be open to change, improvement, or a better path forward. So emphasizing that fact and asking whether they're open can help you qualify a prospect, and it can help your prospect clarify in his or her mind, is this a problem I'm really ready to start working to address? Deborah, any thoughts?
It's important to decide when you want to meet with somebody. Do you want to meet with them very early in the buying cycle when they maybe haven't even thought about your products and services? Or do you only want to meet with somebody when they're actually in a consideration mode? Once you decide that, then you'll know how to focus the questions you want to ask them. And whether you want to focus more on offering the benefits of your appointment, some new trends and ideas that you want to share, or do you want to get into the more specifics of why somebody may need your particular services?
Right, and that actually is a good segue to our next set of scripts, because it gets into different types of questions that you can ask your prospect based on however they respond to your initial reason for your call. So again, we lump these scripts into the category, let me ask you something, because no matter what you say is the reason for your call, and no matter how good your what we do statement might be, your prospect is likely to offer some amount of resistance. And the key to driving the conversation forward and to, as Deborah just mentioned, homing in on exactly what you want that next step to be is through pointed questions that open up the opportunity for your prospect to talk about their own problems and priorities and willingness to address them. So each of the questions here is tailored to a specific type of resistance your prospect might offer. For example, if your prospect makes it seem like everything is going great in spite of tough economic circumstances, you can ask question number 3, can you share some of the details of what you're doing so I can understand what's working so well for you in this new environment? And that might give them pause and open up about something that isn't going perfectly, or even if it is, they'll start talking about specifics of their approach that you can drill down on. And it's important to note here that these are all obviously pretty generic questions. And the point is that no matter how a prospect resists, there's always a question that you can ask that can elicit valuable information to keep the conversation moving. But for your own purposes, you might want to modify these questions, as Deborah just suggested, to make them more specific to your own industry or service, and to demonstrate the value that you can provide in an appointment. So for example, you could cite a study or a statistic about trends in your industry and ask if your prospect's approach is in alignment with that trend. And that kind of approach can point to the value your prospect gets from meeting with you, even if they never become a client. And finally, if your prospect continues to stonewall, a good open-ended question might be, can you think of any way I can be helpful to you? And a key point here, again, is to prepare for and even welcome that resistance from your prospect. If you know it's going to happen in a majority of cases, and you know the challenge of cold calling is turning that resistance into a conversation, then these questions should almost be sort of your arsenal for dealing with the resistance that you know is going to come. And the most successful cold callers are the one who welcome the resistance and engage with it and are able to turn it around. Again, questions are great ways of keeping the conversation moving and shifting the focus back to your prospect. So you're not talking, your prospect is, and when your prospect is talking, it's more likely to be about the problems and priorities that you can help solve. And then the 70-30 rule, when you're talking, that means your prospect is less likely to be interested. When your prospect is talking, they're more likely to be interested. So trying to spend about 70% of your time listening versus 30% of the time talking. And a great way to prove that you are listening is by bridging from what your prospect says. So use your prospect's answer to ask another clarifying question that steers the conversation toward how you can help. So for example, so you're not interested because problem or priority isn't a top priority right now, or you mentioned this, tell me more about that. Based on what you're telling me, this is the problem, how does that affect you? Deb, do you have anything else on general questioning strategies?
If your goal is to set up another meeting, which it generally is, and you find yourself talking about the value of your products and services, you're going to generally talk yourself out of the next appointment. So make sure that you're talking about the value of this next meeting, the importance of this next meeting, and set that appointment and get off the phone.
And it's interesting that you mentioned selling that appointment now. Previously, you might remember we had a script that was about selling the appointment, but I actually removed it from this presentation because it's much less about specific words that you say to sell the appointment than it is about selling the appointment should be infused in every single step of this process. Figuring out that next step and getting only to that next step by offering value to your prospect, even if they don't go any further, is the key not only to cold calling, but to successful cold prospecting generally. So constantly thinking about offering value no matter what happens next. And that brings us to our final script, which is just sort of another twist on how to keep the conversation moving. We like to keep it called the last resort. And it's sort of a lighthearted way of, again, keeping the conversation moving or to secure an agreement for you to follow up at a later date. So one way of doing this would be the 3-6-9 question. If your prospect still won't budge, you say something like, okay, I understand you don't want to meet me right now. Let me ask you 3, 6, or 9. They'll say, what do you mean? And you say, when should I follow up? In 3, 6, or 9. And the idea here is to let your prospect define that time frame. So they'll say in 3 days or 6 months or 9 weeks. And that allows them to establish the terms of follow-up. But if you're not comfortable sort of with that sort of cute approach, a more direct way of asking the same question might be, apparently I can't help you at the moment since things keep changing quickly. I'd like to stay in touch, but don't want to bother you. When do you suggest I connect with you again? And for both of these approaches, the point is to give more direction to the conversation, even if it might be ending for now, and to set up an opportunity for follow-up. And again, letting your prospect define the time frame is similar to asking permission at the beginning of the call. When he or she sets the terms, the engagement is more likely to be congenial and productive. And it also gives you the opportunity to ask what might change between now and then. So it's another question that might elicit an answer that gives you valuable information you can use to keep the conversation moving. And then finally, it's important to note that this kind of last resort question is only for qualified prospects. You obviously don't want to follow up with a prospect that you've determined is not a good fit for you during the course of the call. Deb, did you have anything on that script before I talked about breakout rooms?
You're good to go.
Great. So that concludes the presentation on the scripts. But before we split up into the breakout rooms, just in an effort to give some guidance to the conversation you guys have, I wanted to leave you with a few questions that might help spark further discussion. So I mentioned earlier the idea of friction in cold prospecting. Obviously, it doesn't apply just to cold calling, but thinking about whether there is any friction in your cold calling or email prospecting strategies and how you can reduce it. And then general questions about how your cold calling strategy has changed over the past 16 months. Have you found it to be harder, easier, or the same as it was pre-COVID? As I mentioned, if you have a voicemail script and are willing to share it, that would be really helpful and interesting. If you have any go-to questions like the ones we just mentioned to get your prospect talking. Again, about selling the appointment, even if they never do business with you. How do you answer that question? Why should I meet with you? Do you use email prospecting in any way to complement, reinforce your cold calling strategy? We've seen a lot of success for ourselves and for clients who've used both in tandem with each other. And then what about the scripts we discussed today? Do you think needs to be changed or updated? Always great to receive input so you can make sure all this is relevant and informative. So with that, I will let everybody unmute themselves, and I'm going to start the breakout sessions. It'll take just a minute to make sure that we have the right wise guys in the right session, but I will obviously share this presentation